The chess move that shocked a world champion. That world champion was Emanuel Lasker, and the opponent was Harry Nelson Pillsbury. If you don't know much about Pillsbury, he was one of the great players in the world at the turn of the last century. Tragically, he died at 33 and had mental and health problems that kept him from reaching his peak, but he had an equal score against the world champion Emanuel Lasker, and I believe won Hastings in 1895. And this game shows his really tremendous his genius. And he plays a move that clearly surprises Lasker. And what follows is a series of beautiful attacking and sacrificial moves. Let us jump right in. Pillsbury has white, Lasker has black. D4, D5, C4, E6, knight C3, knight to F6. And we have the queen's gambit declined on the board. Pillsbury goes ahead and develops his king's knight, and Lasker plays c5. The main move is probably bishop e7, but Lasker wants to mix it up in the middle of the board. He gets those pawns there clashing with each other, and Pillsbury's okay with that. He doesn't take one of the pawns. He builds the tension with the move bishop to g5, pinning that knight on f6 against the queen and saying, you can exchange in the center if you would like, Lasker, which he does. He takes on d4. Pillsbury takes with the queen, and now knight to c6, seemingly gaining a tempo against the queen on d4. And he could just move his queen to h4, but Pillsbury, being an aggressive tactical player, goes ahead and takes the knight on f6. This works because it counterattacks the queen, and Lasker does not want to retake with the queen because then the pawn structure would get damaged after the queens are exchanged, and he wouldn't have any dynamic compensation. Um, it's a mistake to take white's queen here, because after bishop takes queen, knight to c2 check, king d2, knight takes rook, it looks like black is winning material. The problem is after the bishop retreats to h4, Pillsbury would just play e3, develop the bishop, and he'd win the knight and get two minor pieces for a rook, and he'd be better in that case. So instead, just take on f6 with the pawn. And at the moment, queen to h4 is played, and Pillsbury is threatening to take on d5, creating an isolated pawn, and he would have very sickly pawns on the king's side, a lot of isolated pawns. So Lasker goes ahead and takes on c4 himself. Rook to d1, developing that rook with tempo, attacking the queen, and Lasker just develops his own bishop, blocking at d7. Now e3 to develop that last minor piece, and of course aiming to take on c4. Knight to e5 is played. Of course, temporarily that defends the pawn, even though it's attacked twice. But he's looking to exchange that knight, and Pillsbury does take it, fe5. And we can see the queens could be exchanged here. But Pillsbury's reasoning, I imagine, is that, well, Lasker's king is in the middle of the board, and White's is too, but he'll be able to castle behind a group of healthy pawns here. So he wants to keep queens on the board and go after that king. So he takes the pawn with the queen instead of the bishop. Queen to b6, attacking the b2 pawn. And as in so many lines, that b2 pawn is dangerous to capture. It's poisoned. Here, Pillsbury goes ahead and says, you can have it. That doesn't mean that taking it is a bad move. It just means White's going to get some pretty good counterplay. And Lasker says, you know what? I think I can take it and survive. And he goes ahead and takes the pawn at b2. And Pillsbury just castles. Of course, he can gain a tempo against the queen by rook to b1. The rook is putting some pressure on this bishop on d7, which could cost black the right to castle for the exchange. But black goes ahead and plays rook to c8. Lasker kicks that queen. The queen moves to d3. Of course, at the moment, queen takes bishop mate is on the board. So Lasker plays rook to c7 to guard that piece. And now knight to e4. You'll notice that this d6 and f6 square, these are very weak dark squares. And Pillsbury wants to exploit that weakness. So by putting that knight on e4, he attacks both of those squares. At the moment, he's actually threatening knight to f6, which would win a whole piece. He would win the game because after knight f6 check, he would be attacking d7 three times with a knight on f6, a rook, and a queen. So Lasker's move is pretty much forced. Bishop to e7 to control that square. And here, knight to d6 check. Now, what Pillsbury wants is for Lasker to take that knight. And after queen to d6, Lasker's lost the bishop pair. He still has the pawn weaknesses, and his king is still in the middle of the board. Pillsbury's gaining a tempo against the rook at c7, and he's clearly better. So Lasker's not going to do that. He moves the king over. He'd rather give up castling rights, which he wasn't going to be able to castle anyway, and keep the bishop pair and keep that dark squared bishop on the board. So Pillsbury plays knight to c4, attacking the queen, putting some pressure on e5. Queen to b5, escaping the attack and also defending the pawn laterally. So we ask ourselves a question, the one Pillsbury asked himself: how do I get at this king? What move can I make that's going to open up my position, that can get all my pieces to aim at that black king? And this was his move, the very strong f4. The idea, of course, is to open the f-file so that rook is aiming right at the king. And the best move here for black is just to play e4. Better to give up that pawn and keep the lines closed. But Lasker did not play that, and the reason I think he didn't play it is because he anticipated a certain variation. He takes the pawn, and he anticipated, I imagine, that Pillsbury would take with the rook, and after bishop to e8, he still has the bishop pair. f7 is sufficiently defended, and even modern computers actually give black a slight edge, surprisingly, in this position. And I imagine Lasker, this is the move he had in his mind. But this is where Pillsbury made the move that must have shocked him. At this point, I'm sure Lasker realized, I've made a big mistake. And this was Pillsbury's shocker. Queen to d4, attacking the rook at h8. And now he'll be able to retake this pawn with the queen and have much, much more pressure. In fact, rook to g8 just loses on the spot. The queen takes f4, attacking the rook at c7 and threatening mate on f7. He has to lose a whole rook, and he would lose the game immediately. So that forces Lasker to make a further weakness and make his king vulnerable. He plays the move f6 to block the attack on his rook. But now queen takes f4, hitting the rook at c7 and threatening some shenanigans with the queen coming into h6 and delivering check. The queen goes to c5 to defend the rook. And now another beautiful move, knight to e5, getting that knight involved in the attack, and the knight cannot be taken because of the pin down the f-file. If the queen were to take the knight, you just play queen takes queen. You lose a whole queen. The pawn can't recapture because of the pin. So this is a big problem for Lasker. Beautiful knight move. Bishop to e8 to help the defense, maybe add some defense to f7 and this diagonal. Here, Pillsbury plays knight to g4. Modern computers show us an even more devastating strike, queen to g5, taking further advantage of that pin and threatening rook to f6, which is just devastating. The game would pretty much be over at that point. But Pillsbury makes a much more normal move, knight to g4, piling on pressure to that f6 pawn. The best defense here was rook to g8, but after taking on f6, you can take on e6, and white is better, but black doesn't need to resign just yet, although, again, white is winning even still there. But Lasker plays the move f5, which certainly makes a lot of sense. Queen to h6 check, attacking the king as well as the pawn at e6. So king to f7 to defend that pawn, and here Pillsbury does not let up. He adds another piece into the attack using tactics, bishop to c4, attacking that pawn, the queen and the bishop. And if the bishop looks like it's hanging, the queen can just take it. The problem is knight to e5 check, forking the king and the queen so the bishop cannot be touched. So he's got to deal with this threat to e6. So he plays rook to c6 to defend that pawn. But the tactics just come nonstop. Rook to f5 check. The pawn can't take the rook because the bishop is pinning the pawn, which cannot be taken because the knight would fork on e5, basically forcing queen takes f5, and now rook to f1, pinning the queen. Queen takes rook, king takes rook. So he's gotten a queen in exchange for these two rooks, and it doesn't seem like such a bad deal for black. The problem is what remains on the board is just far too dangerous and far too hard for Lasker to deal with. Of course, if he takes on c4, knight to e5, the same forking idea, queen e6 can't affect queen c4, and white is just completely winning in that variation. So Lasker plays bishop to d7, queen to h5 check, king g8, and now knight to e5, hitting the rook, but more importantly, threatening mate on f7. And in this position, Lasker resigned The line of great, it's a forced mate here. The line of greatest resistance for black is this. Let me show you. It's a very neat mate. King to g7, queen to f7 check, king to h6, knight to g4, king g5, queen to g7 check, king to h5. And here, the beautiful solution to this little problem, knight to f6 check, bishop takes, then bishop to e2 check. And if after the king moves, you can play queen to g4 mate, or you can just take the bishop. Like they crisscross, and that is also a mate. Of course, Lasker is one of my heroes, one of the heroes of this channel, but every once in a while, a strong player comes in and shocks even the greats. And this was an example of that from Harry Nelson Pillsbury. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.